Um, so our next speaker is Eric Sivers. Eric is the policy analyst here at Montana Department of Environmental Quality in our water department. Eric has worked in DEQ's water quality programs for almost 20 years. His experience includes source water protection, total maximum daily loads, groundwater discharge permitting, and 401 certification, preparing him for his current role as policy analyst spanning the water quality division. Prior to moving Montana in 2004, he worked as an environmental consultant in the New York City metro area. He has degrees in geology from College of William and Mary and BS, and University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where he got his master's. Eric?
Thanks, Steve. Hopefully you can hear me on the microphone. One of the drawbacks to being a little taller. So I'm here to present from DEQ's perspective where we are. I probably could have subtitled this, How to Think Like a Regulator, and it's kind of a guided tour through the uncertainty that's facing Montana DEQ in our current environment. So maybe long on uncertainty and short on answers, but I'll provide clarity where possible. So before I talk specifically about wetlands, I think it might be worth a brief overview to discuss how the state regulates waters. And that's both under the Federal Clean Water Act and under the state Montana's Water Quality Act. So under the Clean Water Act, states and tribes can assume primacy for federal programs. And so Montana DEQ has done that with quite a variety of federal programs under both the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, Clean Air Act, et cetera. So the Water Quality Division is responsible for a variety of Clean Water Act programs. The major ones of relevance are Section 402, which is the NPDS and MPDS permit programs. So those are traditional discharge permits, such as the City of Helena's discharge permit, stormwater permits, CAFO permits, things like that. We also have the 303 and 305 programs, which are water quality standards, monitoring and assessment, biennial reporting to Congress on the state of Montana's waters. So these are the activities of largely our Water Protection Bureau and our Water Quality Planning Bureau. The important point here is that once the state has to be able to demonstrate to EPA that it has the ability to provide adequate protections to these federal programs. So once we've assumed a program, it applies not just to waters of the United States, but it applies to state waters. So then we start looking at our definition of state waters, which I'll get to a little bit later. Montana has not assumed the Section 404 program, which is the dredge and fill program that we've talked about earlier. Some states have, it's a minority of states that have, and obviously we've heard that since the Sackett decision came out, there have been a few more states that have been interested in it. We currently do not have the 404 program. So we are one of the states that does primarily protect wetlands through application of our 401 authority, which is not something that we need to assume. The statute, the Clean Water Act, directly provides that authority to states and tribes. So there actually is there's no Montana law regarding state Section 401. We have administrative rules, but the federal statute gives us that authority. So we do review 404 permits under our 401 program. Keenan Starrar here in the front, maybe a lot of you probably know, he's our lonely 401 coordinator at Montana DEQ and handles all of that work for us. We do also have some state water specific responsibilities that are not related to the Federal Clean Water Act, such as our 318 permits, which are also administered by Keenan. That again applies to waters of the state, applies to state waters. It doesn't have to be a water of the U.S. to trigger 318 requirements. A 318 is it's a little unusual. It's It's for construction activities in state waters. What a 318 authorization actually does is it sets aside the numeric criteria for turbidity in favor of the narrative criteria for turbidity for a period of 1 year. So it's short-term turbidity related to in-stream construction. We have used that for some construction activities that fell out of WOTUS but did fall into Montana state waters, such as the Keystone XL pipeline. There was a non-jurisdictional wetland that was planned to cross that we did require a 318 permit for. Obviously, you fall out of mitigation and those sorts of things, but there was a state authorization that did require construction best management practices and a variety of other restrictions related to that. So that is one of those things that we have employed in certain situations to protect non-jurisdictional waters. There's also the 310 permit, which is bed and banks that's administered by conservation districts. And then there are floodplain management requirements in certain flood prone areas. Worth noting, and I was going to mention this later too, but I remind myself of a note here. Montana did consider assuming the 404 program in 2017. Senator Chaz Vincent floated Senate Bill 48 that would have authorized the state or directed Montana DEQ to assume 404 permitting, but that did not make it out of committee in that legislature, and that's the last time that has been proposed. So we have considered it, but we haven't adopted it. So how do we regulate wetlands? As I mentioned, primarily it's through our 404 or through 401 certification of 404 permits issued by the Corps. As I mentioned, we've also used the 318 authorizations in certain circumstances. The only place that Montana DEQ actually specifically regulates wetlands and specifically identifies them is in our mixing zone rules. Which is kind of an odd place to find them, but that's where they are. So generally speaking, we employ both 401 certification and occasionally 318. Although, as I mentioned, 318 it's a tool we use, but it's maybe not the best fit tool. But we have used it to exert some state handprint on what we have identified as a water of the state when there is no federal jurisdiction. So the big question is, how has SACIT affected our work? Will it? Obviously, Donna mentioned this in her statement or in her presentation. SACIT has no effect on state waters. So it doesn't affect the how, but it might affect what our workload is, primarily through the 401 workload that we're seeing from 404s. To date, Keenan noted that he hasn't really seen a drop off in 401 individual certification workload that he's working on. It's hard to say at this stage how definitive that is because we're also seeing a construction boom. So, he's seeing a lot of individual 401 certs from the Gallatin Valley. Is that because there's a lot of construction going on in the Gallatin Valley? Is it because of the geography of the Gallatin Valley? Those wetlands that are impacted tend to be jurisdictional versus non-jurisdictional. I don't know that we have great answers to those questions yet at this point, but what at this point we can say is that our 401 workload for 404 permits related to wetlands is not declining, but hard to read into those tea leaves too far at this point. So that's the question. Is there a gap? I've lost track of how many webinars I've been invited to in the last few months about how to fill a gap between WOTUS, post-SACIT, and state waters. At this point, theoretically, there probably is, but we haven't really identified the magnitude of it yet. But think it's worth noting that in doing some of my homework for this presentation, it's kind of funny, 90s nostalgia is pretty big right now. EPA issued in 1990 a water quality standards for wetlands guidance document. And one of the items in there was talking about how basically any natural wetland is a water of the US, and states need to develop their definitions of state waters that are at least as encompassing as the federal definition, which is obviously the opposite of where we are these days. So I thought it was interesting to look back at that. This predates the Swank decision when, this confidence is based on the idea that the use of wetlands by migratory birds creates that interstate use, and so therefore federal regulation. But that went away after the Swank decision. But it's fun to look back sometimes. So we've heard about the waters of the US. Let's look at Montana state waters. Montana's surface water classification and beneficial use designations are a watershed-based system. Watershed by watershed, there are specific assignments of classification with specific exemptions or call-outs. So what this means practically is, as a result, wetlands have the same beneficial uses and water quality standards as streams in that same watershed. Oftentimes these beneficial uses and criteria are not appropriate for a wetland, but that's the way that Montana's state water classifications work out. So again, the important point there is that waters of the state are classified by watershed with specific exemptions. And you can also see we have our specific call outs on what are not waters of the state are there. Basically, it's wastewater and irrigation water that is consumed. So this leads to the question, are wetlands waters of the state? And what I'm trying to illustrate here is a little bit of confusion and uncertainty on whether or not wetlands are waters of the state. The Montana Water Quality Act doesn't mention wetlands in our state waters definition. You saw it called out drainage systems. So I think a reasonable person might think about that and say a wetland is part of a drainage system. We don't have wetlands water quality standards. There was an effort about 12 years ago at Montana DEQ to develop beneficial uses and criteria that ultimately didn't move forward. That was before I was in a position that paid attention to that. Linda is probably in a good position to tell us why that ultimately didn't move forward, and maybe I'll talk to her later. But currently we do not have wetland specific water quality criteria or beneficial uses. One of the things underpinning the uncertainty here is that in 2002, DEQ Legal wrote an opinion for the then director stating, to answer this question, obviously under the legal and regulatory environment of 2002, are wetlands waters of the state. And the author of that opinion came back with what I can summarize as, if there is water in a wetland, it's a water of the state. If there's no water in a wetland, it is just wet land. Yeah. So I can imagine from the response, many of you find that unsatisfactory or and there I do see issues with that. Myself, some of those have been identified, but for its shortcomings, that still does guide a lot of our approach, but it's inconsistent, right? The following year in 2003, Montana developed the D, E, and F water body classifications. You can think of that shorthand as D for ditch, E for ephemeral, and F for I don't really know what that means, but yeah, F is kind of weirdly defined as a stream that could support aquatic life, but because of hydrogeographic features, it doesn't. So the important point, though, is that there are no D, E, or F water bodies in the state of Montana. And there is a reason for that. And this is where we get into the how to think like a regulator. So I told you already that all of the water bodies in the state are classified by watershed. And so, you know, a wetland in the Gallatin Valley is going to be a B1 water because it's in that upper Missouri watershed identified in rule. And so as a B1 water, it has beneficial uses assigned to it. If it were to be reclassified as an E3 or an E4 water, which by the definition, if you're reading through our rules, you might think, yeah, this describes a wetland pretty good. This is probably an E3 or an E4 water. But it's not, because it already has beneficial uses appropriate or associated with the B1 water assigned to it. And so the Clean Water Act calls for any removal of a beneficial use to go through a use attainability analysis. So when these classifications were developed in 2003, the intent was that they would be a tool available to Montana DEQ on a one-at-a-time, single-use basis, where in most cases where receiving water was found to be not appropriately classified, and it would be up to the discharger to take responsibility for a use attainability analysis to reclassify that receiving water as a more appropriate classification. Assigning these D, E, and F classifications statewide is not a viable exercise. So just a heads up there, if you're looking through our water quality classifications and reading through them and thinking, oh, this, for example, this is a ditch. This classification for a ditch seems appropriate. This must be a D2 water. That's not the way it works, unfortunately. So this is the thinking like a regulator part. So even though an E3 is an E3 is a seasonal lake or pond, an E4 is a semi-permanent lake or pond. Those to me sound like, pretty good definition for wetlands, but we have no E3 or E4 water bodies in the state of Montana. But those classifications are, they are available on the shelf. There is a process for use attainability analysis that could assign, that could reclassify a water to that, but that is there is a process for that. But again, to go back to the idea of wetland versus wetland, ephemeral drainages are waters of the state. We regulate discharges to ephemeral watersheds. For example, coal mines. Discharges from coal mines tend to be to ephemeral drainages, and those are regulated under their MPDS permits. We obviously saw seasonal lakes and ponds as waters of the state when we developed these classifications. So again, it seems to me, I'm not an attorney, but here's the reason for that kind of confusing yes, maybe, no, go back to the beginning, because yeah, I guess the punchline is I don't necessarily say that I agree with that legal opinion, but it does kind of define our course of action to a fair degree. So are there opportunities to fill a gap? There are opportunities, or there are things that could be done. There could be legislation to revise the definition of state waters. That's not something that I would anticipate to see, at least not in a more, probably not in a more protective direction. We could employ the E3 and E4 water body classifications, although there's that asterisk there for the reasons that I identified. That's not really a tool that's available to the department to do on a watershed by watershed scale. It's a single water body at a time approach. And we could move forward with developing wetland specific water quality standards and beneficial uses to support those classifications. Again, how applicable that would be, I'm not sure. So none of these are especially easy or viable options at the moment. So really the first step would be to assess any regulatory gap. again, that's still a little foggy. We don't, I wouldn't say we have a great handle on that. We've heard mention already of a stringency provision. Montana is one of the states that does have a stringency provision. Not every state does, but many do. So I've heard the question of, does our stringency provision in the Water Quality Act have any impact on DEQ's ability to fill a gap if one exists? Our stringency provision is specific to certain parts of our Water Quality Act, 301, 302, 303. None of these would have any real impact on our ability to regulate wetlands as state waters. They don't have any impact on our definition of state water. And it would, for example, if we came up with state wetland water quality standards, what our stringency provision would require is that our wetland criteria be no more stringent than federal wetland criteria, for example, because our stringency provision is fairly specific to these, water quality standards, reclassification, non-DEG, and also site-specific standards. And the carve out to that, obviously, when I say site-specific standards, Lake Koocanusa has been much in the news this week with the IJC referral. That was one of the issues there, because we did promulgate a state standard that was more, a site-specific standard that was more stringent than the federal. But there is the stringency provision does require that you provide significant, I forget the wording, but basically you have to provide scientific data that shows that there's a need for it. And that's what we were able to do with Lake Koocanusa. So this would not have any impact on our ability to assume a 404 program. As I mentioned, it's been floated in the past by Senator Vincent. So that still could be an option. I half remember that Senator Vincent's drive to have a state program was that he thought it would be more responsive than the federal program. But the fiscal note in order to accomplish that was large, because we would be held to more responsive timelines and would certainly require a larger staff than the Corps does to do that. So if I remember correctly, our fiscal note to say we could assume a 404 program, but we would need basically another bureau to be able to do that, was a little bit more than people were interested in. And the other thing is it would have to be a fee-based program. We would be charging a fee for something that the Corps currently doesn't charge you a fee for. So that was something that shook out in that. Another question we've heard is a lot of building going on, and how do subdivisions fit in? The big point I want to make here is that DEQ regulation of subdivisions by Montana DEQ does not include land use planning. It's limited to the Sanitation and Subdivisions Act review. Land use planning is specifically reserved to local governments. So counties in particular are responsible for land use planning. That's one of those things that I think a lot of the people on the street don't really understand or appreciate, but the idea that how can DEQ allow this activity here? Well, that's really up to the local government to decide what is the appropriate land use in their area. So there is some land use planning tools for the local government. There's obviously floodplain management and special flood hazard areas. Another thing related to septic system or to subdivisions is many subdivisions tend to be on septic systems, and septic system siting requirements by themselves tend to exclude a lot of wet areas because of the requirement for 4 feet of unsaturated soil below the drain field and above the high water table. So that tends to preclude a lot of septic system placement in floodplains or wetland adjacent areas. So that is kind of, it's not directly applied by DEQ as a wetland protection, but it is something that kind of functionally serves in a similar capacity. Oh, and I should note also that The Platting Act, it's not a water quality act, but the Platting Act does require local county planners or county government to do a environmental review of any major subdivision. And I don't work with the Platting Act a lot, but it does require them to do an assessment of basically water resources that would be impacted by development of a subdivision. And I doubt that there's a lot of teeth applied to that at currently, but it is a tool available to county governments if that was a direction they were interested in going. So any future steps for DEQ? As I said, we haven't really fully assessed the existence of any gap. So Steve is currently leading the effort to do some wetland mapping to understand our jurisdictional changes in Montana. That's underway. He did something similar when the Navigable Waters Protection Rule was promulgated, that showed at that time what was about 50% loss. So we'll see what it looks like once this comes out. Once he's able to provide an estimate there. Also, Montana is currently moving through the process of promulgating narrative nutrient standards. We had numeric nutrient standards. The 2021 legislature directed us to return to narrative nutrient standards and adopt an adaptive management program. The adaptive management program in a elevator pitch provides the opportunity for municipalities to look to non-point source projects to restore beneficial uses in the watershed in lieu of expensive upgrades to tertiary treatment straight away to meet the water quality standard support required by their discharge permit. So if a city that has, say, secondary treatment, the cost of going to tertiary treatment would be considerable. They might find it be more cost effective if they could identify non-point source reductions to help improve the stream via non-point source projects. There are some communities that are certainly excited about this. And so this provides another incentive for more non-point source projects, at least in watersheds that have a significant discharger, say, the Gallatin Valley with Bozeman, for example. So rather than watershed groups looking for things that they can tick off, you might have a municipality who's looking to invest significant resources into something that has real impact on water quality. So I think the AMP is kind of an exciting tool that will be coming down the road. Those rules will be published next month and hopefully be final by the fall. So with any luck, we might start seeing adaptive management programs in some of these watersheds where municipalities are really putting their weight behind some non-point source projects, and that could be pretty exciting. And then the final thing on this slide is non-point source projects incorporated into DEQ's climate grant. I'm not quite as familiar with that as Steve and some of Hannah's folks are, but I know that's something else that we're working on. And with that, hopefully I've left, well, maybe 2 minutes that was 28 minutes. So maybe 2 minutes for questions. I don't want to bite into our break too much, but I'm happy to answer any questions that are sent my way.
I think
Thank
we
you.
have probably enough time for one question. Thank you, Eric.
Yes.
I'm curious how well you think regulatory requirements, and permitting requirements are getting communicated to county governments, local governments, and the public in general.
Not well would be my, I mean, I don't want to sound flip, but yeah, I think that's probably an opportunity for improvement. Thanks.
Maybe one more before we hit break. That was really quick.
Yep.
Rich.
I'm probably off on this, but I seem to remember that the Federal Clean Water Act 319 program required the development of water quality standards for wetlands. Do you know if that's true, or are we in compliance with that?
I don't know that I have an answer for that. Obviously, Hannah,
Yeah, I thought it covered streams and wetlands, but
It doesn't require adoption of wetland standards that I'm aware of. 319 does cover protection of non-point source pollution, reducing non-point source pollution to wetlands. So wetlands can be incorporated into local watershed restoration plans and eligible for receiving 319 funding. But there's no requirement that we develop standards.
And one final thought to your question about communication to local or county and city governments. Counties might start to pay a little bit more attention to it following the Horse Creek Hills decision. I don't know if you followed that, but the subdivision, the phase subdivision in Broadwater County, the judge beat up not only on DNRC pretty heavily, but also on the county for not fulfilling their Platting Act requirements in the environmental review. So counties may start to take a little bit harder look at that coming out of this kind of unrelated decision to what we're talking about here.
So I just wanted to add one thing, as Eric brought in a lot of non-point source, the AMPs. Wetlands are applicable. And so historically, we have not seen a lot of projects that incorporate wetlands, although we're seeing a lot more. And only until very recently did we see a project that was exclusively wetland. So it's a resource that about $1 million a year come into the state to work with local watershed groups to think about wetlands and how wetlands can help improve water quality, because that's how we've started talking about them, not how are we regulating them, but how can we use wetlands to help protect the beneficial uses of water in our state based on the functions that they provide. So we're changing how we speak about them so that we can incorporate them more into the programs that we work with, including we start to see a lot more constructed treatment wetlands that people are interested in. So something just to keep in mind from Eric's talk and how we can move forward with different aspects of wetlands and wetland treatment and using wetlands to help us at a state improve water quality.